Easy English Conversations.
Simple English. Real conversations.
Hey English learners, welcome back to the Easy English Conversations channel, your cozy place to learn easy English through real-life conversations. I'm Alex.
And I'm Emma.
I hope wherever you're listening from today, maybe you're just staring at your laptop pretending to work, you've got a quiet moment to think with us for a bit.
That pretending to work moment is very real. I feel like half of life happens in those little pauses where you're technically doing something, but your brain is wandering somewhere else.
Exactly, and I had one of those moments this morning. I was sitting with my coffee, scrolling through a few emails, and then I noticed something kind of funny. I had 3 tabs open. One was about writing. Another was about learning a new AI tool. And the third was about starting a small online course about psychology.
That sounds like a very Alex morning.
It does, but it also made me laugh a little, because I realized this has basically been my life pattern for years. I get interested in things very quickly, and not just interested like deeply curious.
Yeah.
But then there's always this quiet question in the background. Wait, am I supposed to choose one of these?
Oh, wow. Yeah. That question hits a nerve.
Right? Because we grow up with this idea that a career is supposed to look like a straight line. You pick something early. You commit. You specialize. You become the person who does that thing.
The classic story. Pick a lane, stay in it, and drive forever.
Exactly.
But for a lot of people listening right now, that story doesn't fit at all.
Not even close.
There's this huge group of people, I'd even say it's growing, who feel pulled in a lot of different directions intellectually. They love learning, they jump between fields, they connect ideas that normally don't sit next to each other.
And the strange part is, society doesn't quite know what to do with them.
Yeah, because on paper, it can look messy. A resume that jumps between different skills, different industries, different interests.
Or a LinkedIn bio that looks like someone just threw a handful of puzzle pieces onto the floor.
Exactly.
But the internal experience for those people is actually very different.
It's not random curiosity, it's real fascination.
Right.
It's like your brain keeps finding new doors to open, and every time you open one, there's another hallway behind it.
And another door.
And another one.
And before you know it, you're standing in this giant mental building thinking, okay, which room am I supposed to live in?
That's such a good image.
And I think that's where a lot of frustration starts.
Definitely. Because the world often interprets that curiosity as indecision.
Or lack of commitment.
Or even lack of discipline.
Yeah. People say things like, you need to focus.
Stop jumping around.
Pick something.
But what they don't see is that sometimes the problem isn't laziness.
It's actually the opposite.
Exactly. It's too much interest.
I once heard someone describe this as the buffet problem.
Oh, I love that already.
Imagine walking into one of those giant buffets. Hundreds of dishes. Everything looks amazing.
Dangerous situation.
Very dangerous. Because what do most people do?
They panic and put everything on their plate.
Exactly. A little pasta, a little sushi, some dessert for some reason.
And suddenly, your plate is chaos.
Total chaos.
And the funny thing is, when that happens, you don't really enjoy any of it.
Right. Because everything is mixed together. Nothing gets real attention.
That metaphor feels painfully accurate for a lot of careers.
Yeah. People start learning design, then marketing, then coding, then psychology, then business strategy.
And every one of those things is genuinely interesting.
But instead of building depth anywhere, they're just collecting samples.
Like career tapas.
Exactly.
And here's the tricky part. While you're doing that, it can feel productive.
That's such an important point.
Because learning new things always feels like progress.
You watch a course. You read a book. You try a new skill.
Your brain gets that little dopamine hit.
Look at me. I'm growing.
But underneath that, something else is happening.
Yeah,
There's this slow fog of uncertainty.
that's a good phrase.
Because the more options you see, the harder it becomes to choose a direction.
And the fog gets thicker.
Exactly.
You start asking questions like,
What if I pick the wrong thing?
what if I should actually be doing something else?
What if my real path is just one more course away?
And that's when people get stuck.
Totally stuck.
Not because they're incapable.
But because their attention is spread too thin.
And there's another subtle trap hiding in there.
Oh yeah?
Comfort.
Ah, the comfortable middle.
Exactly. Learning new things is safe.
Starting something new is exciting.
But finishing something, committing deeply, becoming accountable to one direction,
That's scary.
because once you choose something, there's risk.
You might fail.
You might discover you're not great at it.
Or worse, you might realize you actually love it, which means now you have to take it seriously.
Right.
And that's where the interest chaos really starts to slow people down.
I like that phrase, interest chaos.
Because that's what it feels like internally. A lot of movement, but no clear vector.
Exactly. Energy without direction.
And historically, the advice has been pretty simple.
Specialize.
The classic deep specialist.
Become extremely good at one thing.
Right. A single vertical line.
Sometimes people call that the I-shaped skill profile.
It made sense in a lot of industries for a long time.
One deep expertise. That's your identity.
Even in tech for a while, be the database person, the back-end person, the security person.
Doctors, lawyers, engineers.
Absolutely.
And that model still works in certain environments.
Yeah. Because it almost asks you to amputate parts of your interests.
But for people with wide curiosity, it can feel suffocating.
You have to ignore a lot of things you naturally want to explore.
That's a dramatic way to put it, but it's kind of true.
The T-shaped model.
And that's why another model started becoming popular.
So imagine the letter T.
Exactly.
But the horizontal line represents a broad understanding of related areas.
The vertical line is still your deep expertise.
But you also understand design.
So maybe you're a software engineer.
Maybe even some psychology or user behavior.
You know a bit about product strategy?
And it makes you more adaptable.
That horizontal bar lets you collaborate across fields.
It's a big improvement over the rigid specialist model.
Which is great.
Right.
But even that doesn't fully capture what some people experience.
They develop several.
Because some people don't just have one deep area.
But more than one.
Maybe not dozens.
That's when things get really powerful.
And those areas start interacting with each other in interesting ways.
And you're not just someone with surface-level knowledge across many fields.
Exactly. Because suddenly you're not just a specialist.
Someone who can connect different peaks of expertise.
You're something else entirely.
Especially in a world where industries are blending together more and more.
And those connections can create surprising value.
None of these things live in isolation anymore.
Technology, psychology, storytelling, data, design.
But here's the problem.
And the job market is slowly starting to reflect that reality.
Exactly.
Most people who have that kind of curiosity still don't have a clear structure for how to manage it.
But they also know that doing everything at once leads to that buffet plate problem.
They know they don't want to squeeze themselves into a single narrow lane.
No clear identity.
Too many things piled together.
So the real question becomes,
No real momentum.
something that actually moves your career forward.
How do you turn wide curiosity into something coherent?
And maybe the deeper question is this.
Instead of scattering your energy everywhere,
What if the real challenge is learning how to organize multiple interests so they actually reinforce each other?
what if the goal isn't choosing one path at all?
Then, having many interests isn't a weakness,
Because if that's possible,
but only if you structure it correctly.
it might actually be an advantage.
What does that structure actually look like?
So maybe the conversation we should start exploring is this.
What does that structure actually look like?
So maybe the conversation we should start exploring is this.
Exactly. It's one thing to recognize the pattern. It's another thing to turn it into a strategy.
Yeah. Because I think a lot of people listening right now might be nodding along thinking, okay, yes, this is my brain, but what do I actually do with it?
I love this concept because the first time I heard it, it immediately made sense.
And this is where I think a really interesting idea comes in, something people sometimes call the M-shaped skill profile.
If you picture the letter M, you don't just have one peak,
Same here.
multiple areas where your skills go deep.
You have several.
Exactly. The valleys between them aren't empty, they're where ideas interact.
And between those peaks, there are connections.
It's in how they reinforce each other.
That's such an important part of it. Because the power isn't just in having several skills.
And also understands psychology.
Right. Think about someone who's deeply skilled in storytelling.
That combination is completely different from someone who only has one of those abilities.
And maybe they've spent years working with digital media.
You can understand why people respond the way they do.
Exactly. Suddenly, you can design content that emotionally connects with people.
3 peaks. But together they form something much stronger.
And you know how to distribute that content effectively.
Yeah, the most interesting professionals today rarely fit into one box.
And we see this all over the place now.
A designer who understands business strategy.
A product manager who understands coding.
A writer who understands technology.
A marketer who can analyze data.
And intersections are where a lot of innovation happens.
These people operate at intersections.
But, and this is a big but, the M-shaped idea can still go wrong if people misunderstand it.
Exactly.
Because some people hear multiple peaks and think it means collecting as many skills as possible.
Yeah, that's important.
Exactly. Just a taller buffet plate.
Which sends us straight back to the buffet problem.
The key is that the peaks need to be intentional.
Right.
That word theme is really useful here.
They should connect to a theme.
That's so true.
Yeah. Because when you look at someone's career from the outside, what people are actually trying to understand is the story.
Exactly. Not just what they can do, but what ties it all together.
They're asking, what is this person about?
But when there's a clear theme, suddenly everything makes sense.
And when someone's skills look completely unrelated, it creates confusion.
That's a great theme.
For example, someone might say, I help people understand complex ideas.
Maybe they teach.
Under that umbrella, maybe they write.
Those are different skills, but they point in the same direction.
Maybe they build digital tools that explain things visually.
And that's the difference between scattered curiosity and structured curiosity.
Exactly.
Because curiosity itself isn't the problem.
Structured curiosity. That's a great phrase.
But fuel without direction just burns.
It's actually the fuel.
So, when people start thinking in terms of an M-shaped skill profile, the first step isn't what else should I learn?
Right.
Yes, the main track.
It's what's the central track?
The thing people can easily recognize you for.
The main track is basically your primary specialization.
And this is where a lot of multi-potentialites get uncomfortable.
The thing that anchors your professional identity.
Exactly.
Because it feels like choosing.
Yeah, that's important. It doesn't have to be forever.
Even if it's temporary.
Otherwise, everything floats.
Right. But you still need a center of gravity.
Without a main track, your skills never gather enough momentum to compound.
I like that image.
Because real professional strength usually comes from depth over time.
That's such a good point.
Exactly.
Not from constantly restarting.
Then build two supporting peaks around it.
So the idea is, pick a main track.
Something that amplifies your main expertise.
Supporting peak 1 is usually what people call a value-add skill.
A value-add skill might be product thinking.
For example, if your main track is software engineering,
Something that makes your engineering more impactful.
or user experience design,
That's often what people call a bridge skill.
supporting peak 2 is a little different.
Or another group of people.
A skill that connects you to another domain.
Or storytelling.
For example, communication,
Bridge skills let you translate between worlds.
or data analysis.
Because most organizations struggle with communication across disciplines.
Which is incredibly valuable.
Designers don't always speak finance.
Engineers don't always speak marketing.
Exactly.
But someone who can bridge those languages becomes indispensable.
A main track in the middle.
So now, instead of chaos, you have a structure.
And a clear theme connecting them.
2 supporting peaks.
But there's still one more piece missing.
That's the skeleton of an M-shaped profile.
You still need commitment.
The time dimension.
Especially people who love exploring.
Because structure alone isn't enough.
Commitment feels limiting.
And this is where a lot of people struggle.
Exactly.
Because exploration feels exciting.
I love this idea because it removes the pressure of forever.
But without commitment, the structure never gets built.
Instead of asking, what should I do for the rest of my life?
And that's why some creators and career strategists talk about something called a 90-day commitment window.
90 days is long enough to create real progress.
Right.
Exactly.
You ask, what will I focus on for the next 3 months?
Your main track gets priority.
But short enough that it doesn't feel like a prison sentence.
Every project.
And during that window, the rule is simple.
The supporting peaks are still there.
Every week.
Not distract from it.
Every learning decision.
Momentum.
But they exist to strengthen the main track.
Because progress compounds.
And something interesting happens when people commit to a focused window like that.
Confidence grows.
Exactly.
Instead of constantly asking, what should I do next?
Skills deepen.
Which feels very different psychologically.
And suddenly the fog starts to clear.
Even if the path changes later.
You're actually building something.
And I think that's a really important mindset shift for people with many interests.
It's the difference between wandering and walking a path.
Instead of thinking, I need to eliminate most of my interests.
Right.
Exactly.
Because it reframes the situation.
Your diverse background stops looking like confusion.
You think, I need to organize them.
Which becomes especially powerful when someone reaches a moment in their career where they need to pivot.
And when you start organizing them intentionally,
Because most people think a pivot means starting over.
and starts looking like leverage.
Exactly.
Yeah, Career pivots are fascinating in this context.
Highlighting a different main track.
But for someone with multiple peaks, that's not necessarily true.
But that only works if you know how to communicate those connections clearly.
Often, a pivot is actually about rearranging the peaks you already have
Yeah,
and repositioning your supporting skills,
it's about showing people how those skills fit together.
which is something a lot of people underestimate.
Yeah, because at that point, the conversation shifts from building skills to framing them.
Because it's not just about having the skills,
Most advice focuses on acquiring skills,
and that's where things start to get really interesting.
which is useful, of course.
Exactly. And that's something people rarely talk about when they give career advice.
But eventually, the real challenge becomes something different.
Learn this. Study that. Take another certification.
Right. Because when someone looks at your profile, your resume, your portfolio, they're trying to answer a very simple question.
Sure.
Exactly.
Communicating who you are professionally.
Even if the individual pieces are impressive.
Where does this person fit?
But once you understand the structure, we've been talking about the main track and the supporting peaks, you can start telling a very different story.
And if your experience looks scattered, people struggle to place you.
Instead of listing everything you've ever done,
That's the frustrating part.
the connections between your skills.
A much clearer one.
This is sometimes called professional storytelling.
You highlight the overlaps,
Because humans understand stories much better than they understand lists.
the pattern behind them.
If I say, I've worked in marketing, psychology, and product design, that can sound random.
And it's incredibly powerful.
Suddenly, it makes sense.
Totally.
There's direction.
But if you say, I focus on understanding how people make decisions, and I use marketing, psychology, and product design to influence that process,
Exactly.
there's a theme.
Because pivots can look messy from the outside.
And people can immediately imagine where you add value.
But most of the time, that's not actually what's happening.
This is especially important when someone is going through a career pivot.
Right.
Yeah. People see the jump and assume you're abandoning everything you did before.
But the supporting peaks come with you.
Usually, it's more like rearranging the emphasis.
They just take on new roles.
Maybe your main track changes.
Okay.
They don't disappear.
Deep communication abilities.
I think about someone who spent years in journalism, for example.
At first glance, that might seem like a completely different career.
They develop storytelling, research, interviewing skills.
Suddenly, those storytelling and research skills become huge advantages.
Then maybe they move into tech.
They can explain complex ideas clearly.
But if that person becomes a product strategist,
That's not starting over.
exactly, they can understand users.
And that word leverage is one of the most important ideas in this whole conversation.
They can shape narratives around products.
Because when you think about your skills through the lens of leverage, your perspective changes.
That's leverage.
You start asking, how can the skills I already have amplify each other?
Definitely.
Sometimes the most valuable thing isn't learning something new.
Instead of asking, what new skill should I add?
And in a world that's changing as fast as ours, especially with AI reshaping industries, that ability becomes incredibly important.
Exactly.
Because automation is really good at narrow tasks.
It's combining what you already know in a new way.
If something is extremely repetitive and well-defined, machines can handle it very efficiently.
Yeah, AI is a fascinating factor in all this.
The intersections.
Exactly.
Those are still very human.
But the spaces between disciplines,
Because they're comfortable moving between domains,
The creative combinations of ideas.
and that adaptability becomes a huge advantage when industries shift.
And that's exactly where M-shaped professionals thrive.
Always.
They connect dots that others might not even notice,
Yeah, let's ground it.
which they inevitably will.
Too many interests, not enough direction.
But even with all this theory, I think we should come back to something practical for a moment.
Honestly, I'd start with something very simple.
If someone listening right now feels like they've been stuck in that buffet plate phase,
Choose a theme.
what's a good first step?
Exactly. A theme is more flexible.
Okay,
Or making complex systems simpler.
not a job title.
Once you have that theme, your interests start organizing themselves,
Something like helping people learn,
and others don't.
or helping businesses make better decisions.
And you're supporting peaks.
Because some skills clearly support it.
The 9-0, day commitment.
That helps you identify your potential main track.
For the next 3 months, you intentionally prioritize the main track.
Then comes the second step.
Ship projects.
Right.
That last one is really important
Build something.
because starting is easy.
Finish things.
But finishing gives you evidence.
Yeah. Finishing is underrated.
And execution builds credibility.
Starting gives you excitement.
Exactly.
Evidence that you can actually execute.
You've created momentum.
Not just with other people, but with yourself.
Instead of thinking, I'm someone with too many interests.
After 90 days, something interesting usually happens.
That's a completely different identity.
And momentum changes how you see your own abilities.
When you see yourself as versatile instead of scattered,
You start thinking, I'm someone who can connect multiple strengths.
you become more intentional
And identity shapes behavior.
and less anxious about having a non-linear path.
You start making decisions differently.
Yeah, the idea of one job for 40 years is fading pretty quickly.
More strategic.
New industries, new technologies, new roles.
Which, honestly, is probably the future for a lot of careers anyway.
It'll be the people who understand how to carry their skills across contexts.
Most people will evolve several times.
People who know how to wear many hats, but in a structured way.
And the people who adapt best won't necessarily be the narrowest specialists.
Intentionally.
Exactly.
Maybe that's not a problem to fix.
Not randomly.
Because curiosity, when paired with structure,
So if you're someone who's always felt a little different because your interests don't fit neatly into one box,
especially in a world that rewards adaptability and creative thinking,
maybe it's just a pattern you haven't learned to organize yet,
maybe the goal is to build something more interesting.
can become a real competitive advantage.
Something that reflects how your mind actually works.
And maybe the goal isn't to shrink your interests down to one narrow line.
Your career stops feeling like a buffet plate,
Something with multiple peaks,
with mountains that connect,
because when you do that
and a direction that finally feels like your own.
and starts feeling more like a landscape,
Yeah. A calm moment to sit with that idea.
paths you can move between,
With the right structure, they can create possibility.
that feels like a good place to pause for today.
And wherever you are right now, morning coffee, evening walk, or that quiet moment between tasks,
Multiple interests don't have to create chaos.
what's the landscape of your skills starting to look like?
Thanks for spending this time thinking with us. Maybe take a minute and ask yourself one question. We'll see you next time.